Bloodborne came out a year after Dark Souls 2, but the two games were developed side by side, and the former was specifically the reason Miyazaki was so hands-off when it came to the design process of Dark Souls 2. He also doesn't really like to make sequels in the first place. Bloodborne is a great game worthy of praise for many aspects. All of these games are great, or at least pretty good. From Software titles need to be commended simply for being better and done with more passion compared to most of the other soulless shit that plagues the market nowadays. So we all agree Bloodborne was and still is a great game, but unfortunately I can't speak about it too much with confidence. I have 1.5 playthrough on it, the half being played with the PS Now free trial. I finished this game with no DLC years ago when a friend lent me a PS4, so I don't want to make any harsh criticism or specific praises, because the game isn't fresh enough in my mind. But there are some considerations that I made back then I do remember very well, and I will share them now. The first aspect I want to talk about is Miyazaki himself. He was a rather nobody, as we've discussed. He was mostly known by people who like to discuss the lore or artistic process behind Dark Souls, and not really the public in general. But it's not a surprise that DS2 becoming the black sheep of the series seemed to coincide with Bloodborne's announcement, 3 months after the prior release. This new game was the confirmation for the toxic fanbase that the mastermind and genius behind the DS1 was involved into his next masterpiece, and that DS2 was a fluke handled by people who shouldn't have touched the franchise. I believe that if marketing and release timings for Bloodborne had been different, DS2 might have a slightly better reputation by now. And I believe that if DS2 wasn't so hated, for all the reasons we've discussed, Miyazaki's reputation would be lower instead. In a way, it was the missteps of that game that made the community truly obsessed with this man, and with the popularity and success of Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, games with more mainstream appeal than the previous ones, Miyazaki was cemented as the genius artist behind the series, and DS2 instead fossilized within its layer of mediocrity. While I don't want to be reductionist about his talent, I truly think if it wasn't for Dark Souls 2, his journey to fame would have been very different. The second thing I wanted to mention was how there seems to be a lot of delusion surrounding this game. Even before its release, news coverage and interviews with From Software basically convinced the entire world that Bloodborne was going to be a more aggressive take on Dark Souls. Then the game came out and critics, celebrities and fans all seemed to agree. Bloodborne is genius because it forces you to be aggressive. That was a very common sentence heard within the community. For years I assumed this to be true. Then I actually played the game, and I found out it was a lie. This is the only footage of me playing Bloodborne. This is not a strat I have looked up. I came up with it while facing the same boss in a previous Chalice dungeon. This might not be the most efficient method for killing it, but it's the safest one. The game isn't punishing me for playing defensively and patiently. There is nothing inciting me to be aggressive outside of boredom, I guess, but I wasn't bored during this encounter. This is just an isolated clip though, so we need to look at the design of the game itself to see if this was truly the aggressive Dark Souls people were hyping up. And to start things off, you can already play aggressively in all the other games in the series. I believe the skewed perception on this matter comes from people thinking that defensive means turtling behind a shield. No, defensive is what I'm showing now. As you can see, I don't ever block a single attack. But does Bloodborne reward aggressive play more than Dark Souls? Are there elements to its design that discourage a defensive playstyle? Bloodborne has only one shield, true if you count the DLC one. It's obviously a meme, you are not meant to use it. It's going to get you killed, and game journals and Miyazaki were already telling you that before the game released. But as I've just said, this isn't enough for claiming the game discourages a defensive playstyle. Healing is faster and has its own dedicated button. I'd argue this is a positive change to promote an aggressive playstyle. The game also features the new rally mechanic, and that's the case there too. That's it. Those two are the only elements of the game that specifically reward being aggressive. Both are relegated to healing, which by definition is a less preferable option than just not taking damage, in most situations at least. You could argue that limb breaking also fills a similar niche, but when you actually play in the game it doesn't change anything considerably compared to stuff like poise breaking or backstabbing or staggering that was in the older games as well. So okay, the game has an healing system that allows you to keep hitting the enemy if you want to regain health, but you might as well dodge backwards a couple of times and pop a flask. It takes very little time and it's not risky at all. So maybe Rally is preferable because healing is very limited and... blood vials are easily farmable. Okay, maybe there are incentives to tank damage instead of running away during interactions with enemies. Oh no, wait, you have no poise in this game. Most of your attacks will always be interrupted, usually only charged heavies have hyper armor. But these can't be used whenever you want, they aren't as useful to an aggressive playstyle compared to light attacks. Maybe enemies have very little poise, so you can stun lock them to death. Yeah, sure, you can do that sometimes against the weaker enemies, until they decide to start an attack or combo with arbitrary hyper armor. Okay, so if poise is not in your favor, maybe enemies are just weak. They might deal little damage to you, so you can more easily ignore it. Not really, I'd say it's the same enemy damage scaling as the Dark Souls Trilogy. Well, I'm running out of ideas. Maybe there is a Bloodborne specific mechanic that encourages wailing on a single enemy spamming attacks. Yes, there is, it's called Beast Build-Up, which increases your damage as you keep hitting things, although it requires a specific item, but whatever, it still counts. Maybe you are encouraged to stay close to enemies because they are generally more dangerous at range, and their melee attacks are slow and predictable. No. In fact, most enemies are a total joke at range, especially because you have a spammable ranged parry that deals damage and interrupts opponents even if you fail the parry. And most enemies have very fast and unpredictable opening attacks that last only a handful of frames. And if you're too close to the enemy when the attack comes, you'll need to iframe those, with your quickstep ability which replaces your roll when locked on. Quickstep, in theory, allows for a more aggressive gameplay, mostly because it keeps momentum far better than rolls do. It has lower recovery frames and attacks flow more fluidly. This is a great change, but Quickstep is essentially an iframing tool, and I wasn't quite able to get used to the PS4 input lag and Bloodborne's terrible frame pacing enough to reliably iframe through attacks, especially since Quickstep is harder to maneuver compared to your roll animation. Same applies to the version in DS3 and Elden Ring, at least when locked on. I had a breeze through most of my Bloodborne experience while mostly using the unlocked roll animation, and didn't have to iframe that much. Good positioning and patience allowed me to easily beat this allegedly aggressive take on Dark Souls. I don't want to discredit anyone's experience with the game, especially the experience of those who know it far better than me, but all I can say for sure is that I didn't play a game that rewarded my aggressiveness, or specifically discouraged my defensiveness. I don't have much more to say about it, because any other assessment on Bloodborne's quality or game design would be unfair. But it was important to paint how the game changed the focus of the combat from a careful and methodical playstyle to something a bit faster and more chaotic, specifically by altering the enemy design, making them more spammy, dangerous and aggressive, and the DNA of this new enemy design carried over into the subsequent games, which we'll take a look at next. The style of enemy design and animations introduced in Bloodborne is my single biggest gripe with the post-Dark Souls 2 games in the series. There are other elements I may dislike, but I believe these to be the central rotten core that poisons everything around it. I'll now focus on Dark Souls 3 specifically. This game essentially features Bloodborne enemies, despite being an even less appropriate framework for them. Dark Souls 3 is just faster Dark Souls 2, using retooled DS1 animations. It inherited Bloodborne enemies, but in the process removed rallying, ranged parries and quickstep by default. Instead, quickstep is now just a weapon art that consumes mana points. Your default evasive option is once again rolling, which not only looks and feels more stupid than ever before, but it fundamentally makes the flow of combat much worse. Parry works similarly to Dark Souls 2, it's an entirely close-range, high-risk, high-reward defensive option. This mechanic was designed for the slower enemies of Demon Souls, and doesn't have much place here. Blocking is viable compared to Bloodborne, to some extent. You are still going to get guard broken very quickly by most enemies in the game, unless you invest in a great shield, and even then most bosses will still easily break through your defenses. You have classic Dark Souls magic, so if you want, like usual, you can stay at range and melt enemies with soul arrows, only now you are probably going to have to roll a few times more, and you'll have to sacrifice some healing because of the new Ashen Estus system. Poise is still mostly non-existent, it's just a modifier for hyper armor, which is extremely situational and only really benefits specific builds. It's more of a way to compensate and not make those builds shit compared to others, and isn't an actual game mechanic the PvE designers ever expected you to use. The enemies still deal the same amount of damage as always, despite being faster, more unpredictable and with longer combos. Some of the strength of Souls combat relies in its lethality. You die in a few hits, but every hit feels meaningful. Unfortunately, this philosophy mostly becomes irrelevant the moment enemies are as fast as they are in Dark Souls 3. On average, your character still dies in the same amount of hits as the first 2 games, but enemies can dish out way more hits in the same amount of time, and many of their attacks are way faster as well. The health and damage balance that made the methodical pace of the combat so rewarding is now completely gone. To make things worse, Dark Souls 3 inherited from Bloodborne what I'd call unreactable attacks. Animations, which enemies usually use from neutral stance as an opener, that only last a very handful of frames. A lot of enemies and bosses in this game have stuff like this, and though most of them aren't objectively unreactable, getting hit by any of these attacks is never satisfying or interesting. It feels cheap and unfair. This becomes a major issue when combined with one of the biggest problems with Dark Souls 3, controls. Every game in the series uses the same button for sprinting and rolling. Sprinting activates on press as you move, while rolling activates on button release. This is a frankly stupid design decision, because it adds artificial delay to your primary evasive action. Sekiro for some reason was the only title that managed to fix this issue, but it was never that big of a deal in a slower game like Dark Souls 1 or 2. In Dark Souls 3, with faster and harder to react to enemies, that alone is a terrible gameplay element, but this time around the delay also feels slightly longer than its prequels. Dodging just feels less responsive in this game, which is borderline insane considering how central of a mechanic it is. But we are not done. Another horrible thing inherited from Bloodborne was the poorly programmed input buffering. The first 2 games had some of this as well, but it wasn't that noticeable or detrimental to the experience. It rarely led to me losing control of my character. In Dark Souls 3 instead the input buffering is genuinely infuriating. I have lost count of how many times I mistimed a dodge, got hit before the animation started, and after the stagger animation ended my character finally executed the roll I requested half an hour prior. This becomes even more fun if the enemy chains a new attack that will hit you exactly when the iframes of this new roll run out. Keep in mind, you can't cancel this roll. In fact, you still can't cancel anything in this game, except for a few knockdown recoveries. In Dark Souls 2, with a very brief window, you could actually cancel some attacks and spellcasting animations. In Dark Souls 3, a faster game where it's easy to input things at the wrong time, or just input wrong things, this is no longer possible. You thought you could back away from an enemy to properly observe his moveset, heal or set up a certain move. Well, too bad, because a lot of the bigger enemies, which already have naturally more range than you, have now quick leaps, jumps and lunges that act as gap closers. Creating distance between you and the enemy is no longer a reliable tactic. Something that should work as a defensive strategy becomes instead a chance for your opponent to do another attack. Enemies in Bloodborne also had these ad nauseam, but ranged parries in that game made a huge difference. Don't get me wrong, once you know the enemy movesets well enough, you can punish these attacks. So it's not all bad. The issue is that this change makes positioning more irrelevant than before. And it's not the only factor contributing to this. Even when an enemy isn't literally jumping at you, it might telegraph a melee attack and you think, oh, I'm far enough that I can just back away. Well, sometimes that's just not true. Sometimes enemies can extend their reach more than their animations and speed would suggest, which means getting hit by an attack you thought you could outrange. And again, you eventually learn these subtleties. You learn that those specific enemies do those specific attacks that lunge forward during the animation. It's still not satisfying to deal with them. It feels like the game is punishing you for using your brain and keeping your distance where it makes sense to do so. But why make positioning less relevant and reliable? Well, the answer is very simple, we only need to look at this table right here. By default, on both fast roll and mid roll, Dark Souls 3 gives you 13 iframes, that's the equivalent of a DS1 fast roll, with the difference that now rolls are much more spammable, because of the decreased stamina costs and the shorter recovery times. And they also cover more distance. It seems obvious to me that the entirety of the combat system was designed around iframes. The expectation is for the player to iframe through every attack, which is why positioning is less relevant than before, because you wouldn't need to iframe if you could just get out of the way. The ability to spam rolls allowed the animators and anime designers to give most opponents in the game long, uninterruptible combos where you are expected to iframe through each attack. Some enemies had these combos as well in older titles, but again, there you could just get away. In Dark Souls 3, if you are in melee range, this is rarely possible. Spamming rolls is generally so safe it's the better option when enemies start one of these chains, unless you are very familiar with the reach and hitboxes of these attacks already. There is also the issue of enemies having hard to read tells and animations. Of course, if you can be invulnerable for so long, so easily, there is no reason for animators to actually make good animations, right? But you see, eventually the designers realized that spamming rolls was too effective. Instead of properly tuning and balancing the mechanic before proceeding with development, they just incorporated at least one roll catch move in almost every enemy. These roll catches are generally executed through a delayed attack. In theory, an enemy feinting to catch you off guard is an interesting idea. Enemies varying up their timings and telegraphing their moves is also good. After all, there were delayed attacks in past games as well, but Dark Souls 3 completely butchers the execution. In older games, a delayed attack is generally a telegraph that warns you the enemy is about to perform a very damaging hit or combo. In Dark Souls 3, these animations were made deliberately weird with unnatural momentum, specifically to subvert your expectation of what the timing of the attack would be. A normally telegraphed attack still makes sense, and you can guess when the swing will come, even if you've never seen it before. In Dark Souls 3, the telegraph is a deceit, an illusion. It's something designed to make you roll at the wrong time. It feels like the animators are trolling the player and it's incredibly artificial. The concept of feinting doesn't even really work as a justifying comparison. In real-life melee weapon combat, a feint is a move that's meant to catch the opponent off guard and leave them vulnerable for a counter-attack. An enemy holding their sword up, moving their arm in a weird way for a few seconds, while the player is rolling on the ground like a retard only for the swing to come down and hit him is not the same. Why would an enemy try to make you roll early? Are they aware of the concept of iframes? Do they know that at the end of the roll animation unkindled ones are vulnerable? Do they expect them to roll through their sword swings for no reason at all? It looks and feels so damn stupid, yet I've heard this feinting comparison as a defense for these animations many times. Anyway, you eventually figure out the enemy in front of you is going to delay their attack, so you need to iframe at the right moment to properly avoid it. But you'll soon discover that the animation you actually have to roll through may be too fast to do so on reaction, consistently and deliberately at least, especially once you take the input delay into consideration. What that means is that the only reliable way to dodge these delayed attacks is to know the timings by memory beforehand, which makes encountering these attacks the first few times very annoying. Still, let's assume you don't want to iframe through these attacks, because you don't know the timings yet, and you don't wanna bother learning them. Well, can you block them? Yes, sure. Issue is that blocking, in general, is heavily disincentivized in this game. I did my latest run with a great shield and an ultra great sword, and punishing bosses and stronger enemies after blocking was harder than just iframing through attacks and countering. This is mostly because of how much stamina blocking is, and the general increased momentum of fights compared to older titles. Compared to rolling, a blocking defensive playstyle has the same pacing as the previous entries, and thus can quite keep up with the increased pace of the game as a whole. For smaller standard enemies, it's still an effective strategy, but there is rarely a point since you can easily stunlock them anyway. What about spacing out attacks while staying close to the enemy? Your positioning skills are made irrelevant once again here. In Dark Souls 2, tracking was used to make circle strafing harder to pull off. Despite using DS1 engine and animations as a base, Dark Souls 3 reincorporates tracking from DS2, but in a warped and twisted way. It's now primarily used to prevent you from outspacing these delayed attacks, so not only you can't quite get out of range because of lunges and leaps, but even if an enemy holds his sword in midair for half an hour, you can't actually get behind them or to their side to avoid the attack, because the tracking will make their downswings magnetically follow the player. Once again, iframing through these moves is the intended and most reliable way to deal with them. Tracking doesn't apply only to delayed attacks, and is actually a pretty major blight most enemies and bosses suffer from. To sum it up, if the game wants something to hit you, despite you being technically out of range, the game will find a way to hit you regardless. Overall, these changes to enemy design make the combat throughout the experience pretty samey, repetitive and unsatisfying. You iframe through 1, 2, 3 or even more attacks, then the enemy starts a delayed animation, you wait for the moment you've memorized, and then iframe once again, only to at last counter with 1 or 2 light attacks. Bosses have in general fewer or shorter openings. Using a fast weapon like a straight sword is usually preferable compared to a slower one, which instead must rely on an inconsistent and undertuned hyper armor system to trade hits. The dissonance between long spammy combos and delayed roll catches is also pretty annoying. The game tends to reward and encourages roll spamming. Even when you're trying to run away, rolling over and over is way safer than sprinting. But at times instead you are arbitrarily punished for spamming rolls, because those delayed attacks exist solely to punish players not deliberately timing them. But even if you mistime your dodge once, you can keep pressing the button to perform consecutive rolls, and you may find yourself invincible at the right time to survive the hit which the enemy has been telegraphing the entire time. The fact that some delayed attacks have the same startup animation as non-delayed attacks makes this happen often. In a similar way, the game heavily encourages spamming R1 for staggerable enemies. DS2 actively discouraged this behavior since enemies would be pushed away slightly every time you hit them, and stamina management was more meaningful in general. In DS3, most normal enemies can be stun-locked, except when they arbitrarily start an attack with hyper armor. Once again, there is a dissonance in how the combat encourages and punishes player behavior. But why is this heavy emphasis on iframing through attacks so bad? If the player character has an easily spammable invulnerability window and enemies are designed around it, the combat system as a whole ends up revolving around timings. A lot of things can be dodged on reaction, others not so much, because the animations are either too fast or too deceiving. The fact that most strong enemies and bosses can easily alternate between quick openers, gap closers, long combos, AoEs, and delayed attacks that track you, means that using your instincts and wits is generally not a viable strategy, or more accurately, it's not properly rewarded. It seems the game design expects players to know any movesets well enough before they can properly avoid damage and punish them accordingly. Combat feels like a memory game. It's far from impossible to beat bosses on your first try, but outside of the very easy ones, I doubt it could ever feel as anything more than luck. Instead, their animations and behaviors seem to assume the player will repeat the fight at least a few times, and memorize all the weird timings and whatnot. iframe punish, and so on. I want to talk about the intent behind all of this. The easily spammable rolls with AI invulnerability window allowed the designers to create faster enemies with all of these quirks, and at the same time all these quirks sometimes feel necessary, because otherwise the overpowered rolls would make the fights too easy. Most fights in DS3 are already pretty easy, but you need to face those enemies a handful of times before you can say that confidently, at least for some of them. So it's a chicken or the egg situation. Was it decided to have faster enemies first, so the designers gave you more iframes and more spammable rolls, and then realized that roll catches, lunges and tracking were necessary so that the game wasn't going to be a total breeze? Or did they implement the changes to rolls first, using Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne as a base? Did this process start with the latter, or can it be tracked back to Artorias of the Abyss? Ultimately it's a messy situation, but to me it screams of bad design. The devs didn't know how to craft an experience that was fast-paced, challenging, fair and interesting at the same time, while staying as close as possible to the Dark Souls framework. And Dark Souls 3 comes off as a patchwork of ideas and band-aid solutions to obtain what they seemingly wanted. And what's the result? What was gained by making the enemies and bosses slightly faster? Well, let's take a look at them next. Bosses in Dark Souls 3 are far more visually impressive than the ones from both Dark Souls 1 and 2. Maybe not as much as Bloodborne, but still up there. But all this visual gloriousness comes with a drawback. Those deceptive and weird animations definitely make these creatures feel dangerous, imposing and aggressive. I guess if you like the combat and bosses in Dark Souls 3, it's because they can easily be adrenaline inducing. There is something to enjoy out of this fast-paced action after all. Still, at least for me, it's not enough to make up for the lackluster gameplay experience. On top of the animations, in this game bosses go a bit overboard with particle effects that just get in the way, making the action even less readable. It seems to me presentation, visuals and the cool factor were some of the primary concerns of the designers. Doesn't mean the bosses are all bad, though. Judex Gandir, at least in the first phase, is a good tutorial boss. He readies the player for what kind of foes they'll face later on. He's fairly simple, with very telegraphed attacks that are easy to iframe, but the second phase is where things kind of go to shit. He turns into a giant pus of men, one of the most bullshit enemies in the game because of how hard to read and chaotic they are. Still, you can easily win either by going circles around him while staying close, or by abusing fire damage. Vort reminds me a lot of Taurus Demon, a rather chunky monster that you fight in the second tutorial area, so to speak, and at the Burg in Dark Souls 1 and High Hall in DS3. Both Vort and Taurus are also pretty easy, but since they are tutorial bosses I don't mind that. I don't like how the charge combo Vort does is something you are supposed to phase through. It just looks and feels stupid, but I don't want to repeat myself too much. Curse Rotted Greatwood is awful. This fight is unbearable if you don't have good vertical swings to properly hit all its weak spots, and even then he may just decide to spam the vomit attack over and over. I can appreciate the devs trying to do something different that doesn't revolve around iframes, but the execution is lacking. I guess it's better than Bed of Chaos though. Crystal Sage is, I don't know, interesting, kinda. It's different from other fights, feel like a slightly harder pinwheel, no strong feelings either way. Beacons are next and they are basically a better version of Prowling Magus and Congregation. Much like them, not a real boss fight, more of a challenge room. I like them overall. We then face Abyss Watchers, the first Lord of Cinder in the game. This is one of my favorite fights in the base game, and the series as a whole. The first phase is unique, with the Watchers fighting each other occasionally. Their moveset is fast and spammy, but the enemies themselves are easily staggerable and can be backstabbed, so it all evens out. Second phase is pretty fun as well. Volnir is another gimmicky fight, and it's a pretty shitty one at that. It feels like a worse version of Old Iron King, which was a better version of Ceaseless Discharge, so now I guess it's a challenge between the latter and Volnir. You basically have to wait until he decides to get out of the Abyssal Mist and to keep his arms still, so you can actually hit his bracelets. But hope it doesn't summon skeletons, otherwise the fight will get even more annoying. Old Demon King is optional, and he feels like a DS1 boss fight with more AoEs. He's fine, I like him, but he's a bit too easy and unremarkable. Pontiff Sullivan is next, and I kinda hate him. At least the first phase. Endless combos, instant attacks, gap closers, delayed roll catches, and different attacks with the same startup animations. He has all these things I hate about the enemy design in this game. The second phase is pretty fun, so it's not all bad, but I wouldn't call him good either. He's a fast-paced version of Fume Knight, but not as satisfying to fight. He does look cooler though, so I guess that's enough for it to be the better boss. Aldrich is a pretty good encounter, I think. Feels different from others, but unlike Crystal Sage, is not boring. Is a bit too easy maybe. Yorm is a very interesting boss. The intended method for beating him is using Storm Ruler, which not only makes the fight extremely easy, but also underwhelming. But if you try to fight him with a normal weapon, hitting his arms or head when you can, I think he's actually one of the best bosses in the game. I saved the Sigward on this playthrough, so I wasn't properly able to replicate this strategy in the footage. Your enjoyment in fighting him without Storm Ruler will vary depending on the range and moveset of your weapon. Dancer is also a good boss, she has very weird animations, but that's her whole gimmick and I like the way they executed it. I'm not a fan of her spin to win combo, but that's it. Dragon Slayer armor, on the other hand, I'm not super fond of, for similar reasons to Pontiff Sullivan. He can enter these stuns from which he can perform 3 different delayed attacks. These all feel kind of bullshit and you basically have to memorize the timings. I'm also not a fan of some of his shield bashes. I find them annoying. Osiris is a weird boss. The first phase may as well not exist if you deal enough DPS, but it can still be pretty frustrating if he spams his miss attack over and over. The second phase I think has a pretty cool moveset, but it's made so much worse by the instant charge he can just do whenever the fuck he wants. This fight reminds me of a fast-paced version of something from 2nd generation Monster Hunter. Champion Gandir lacks the Past of Man phase, but what he gains in return isn't much better. Mix-ups with tracking kicks and charges, near instant shoulder bashes with unexpected reach. Yeah, he looks cool and is fast and edgy and whatever, but this is not the kind of combat experience I play these games for. But I wouldn't call him bad. Ancient Wyvern is not a boss, it's a boss-type creature, but the encounter plays more like a stage hazard, which is fine, I guess. I like the idea, but I find the execution boring. I have 2 major issues with this guy. The first is that if you try to fight him normally, it's just a miserable broken experience, and so I wonder why have the creature within melee reach if fighting him that way is as pleasant as castrating yourself with a teaspoon. Second issue, once you decide to perform the intended plunging attack, it straight up doesn't work sometimes. It's a boss with literally one intended way of dealing damage to it, and it's inconsistent. I really dislike this fight. The Twincest duo is one of my favorite fights in the game. The one thing I don't like is the tracking light beam attack that ignores level geometry, which again, you need to iframe through at the right time. Also, Lorian being able to come out of a portal already into an attack animation feels kind of cheap, especially because you can arbitrarily lose lock-on. Outside of these 2 problems, it's a great encounter. Nameless King is probably the hardest boss in the base game, and he gave me quite a bit of trouble on my first playthrough. I like the idea for the first phase, but ultimately the terrible camera and the fact that you have to repeat it every time you die in the second one bring it down immensely. The latter is pretty fun though. The king has some delayed swings, but they feel properly animated, so I don't mind them. Moving on to the first DLC, Sister Friede has two very good phases and a pretty shitty third, that clearly doesn't belong in this game. Way too fast, chaotic and spammy for a game like Dark Souls, where you may be using heavy weapons. It feels like she was designed around the ability to parry at range, like you could in Bloodborne. I think the second phase is a really good duo boss though. The optional boss of the DLC is a half-naked dude with a big wolf you've already fought twice. I don't know, it's kind of shit. The wolf has a cool moveset, but that's it. Starting the second DLC is Demon Prince, which is one of my favorite bosses in the game, and probably my favorite duo fight in the entire series. These two have an excellent moveset. The way they switch and complement their behaviors is interesting and fair. It's intense, fun, and memorable. Half-Light not so much. The NPC version is whatever. If you play against a real player, your enjoyment will mostly depend on how much you like the PvP in this entry. Personally, I am not a fan. Midir is one of the best dragon fights in the series. I prefer Sin, but is pretty close. I don't like a couple of things. First is Rampage attack, which is just an arbitrary waste of time, something not needed with such a huge health bar. But the major issue are the Shin Godzilla breath attacks. Whenever he does them, I have no idea where I'm supposed to be to avoid them. Gale is next and is my favorite boss in the game. He has both long combos and delayed attacks, but his animations are actually well made, and the fight overall has an excellent rhythm. I don't like how visually busy it gets in the first phase, but it's a minor nitpick. Soul of Cinder is the final boss of the base game and is fine, I guess. I like the variety of his moveset, I'm not a fan of some of his attacks though. Still, it's a decent encounter. So these were my brief thoughts about the bosses. But there is more to talk about, because this game isn't a boss rush now, is it? So what about the space in between the bosses, the levels? Are they good in Dark Souls 3? No they aren't. Let's start with the enemies so I can close the previous topics. They have all those tricks I've detailed to ensure they are moderately challenging, even within this faster paced combat. But safely roll spamming your way through areas is very easy. Most enemies in the levels pose little threat, and the ones that do can be easily ignored. Usually the only reason to fight them is because of XP, and even then you don't really need that much to be properly leveled for all the bosses, which seem instead to be the focus of the game. In Dark Souls 1 and 2, the levels were the main curse, and the bosses were the dessert, the cherry on top, and a way to cap off an area with a thematic or challenging encounter. In Dark Souls 3, levels feel like pre-boss corridors. They are a teaser for the fight you are going to experience very soon, with a few exceptions. I often hear how Dark Souls 3 has the best level design in the trilogy, and to me that's a shallow observation. Dark Souls 3 has some very good level layouts. Most levels in the game are large with many optional areas, and some intricate and satisfying shortcuts here and there. It seems to me that people conflated the cool factor of certain shortcuts or the size of these areas with the quality of the level design. All that cool stuff becomes largely irrelevant once you consider that levels are easy to traverse with little to no challenge, or that they are extremely boring with a terrible use of space, or that the loot and itemization is sparse and uninteresting, and most importantly, that they all look and feel the same. The entire game has this ugly brown and grey tint to it. Even in a beautiful area like Hirifil, most of the screen, most of the time, is going to be some variation of grey. You spend the majority of the game walking through Gothic or Baroque architecture, mixed with random rock formations and some trees here and there. There may be a swamp or some other pool of liquid to break up the monotony, I guess. And none of these locations offer anything unique or interesting. These levels feel the exact same to play. And they are so long to boot. Dark Souls 3 is a game that overstays its welcome. The only somewhat interesting level design elements I can think of are the giant shooting arrows either to help you or to hit you in 3 different areas of the game, this other giant trying to hit you with his giant hands, the infinitely respawning zombies, which you can just ignore, the traps in Karthus, the giant ballista in Hysalith, the jailers in Nearfield draining your health, the profane flame that can hit you twice if you mistime your rolls on the bridge, that's a spicy one. The giant snake lady that summons NPCs, I don't know, does it count? Thief's Hands in the archives, that's it. At least for the base game. The Ringed City DLC provides 2 amazing, distinct levels, with quite a few interesting ideas, while Ashes of Ariandel shows you everything it has to offer in the first major area, and after that it overstays its welcome as well. People often shit on levels like Catacombs of Karthus or Profane Capital, because they are too short and simplistic, and for me it's the opposite. If I have to traverse a boring pointless level to get to the boss, I'd rather have it short and painless. So the levels are boring and uninteresting. That alone would make the game a chore to replay, right? Well, I appreciate how consistent the game designers were, because the same can be said for the world design. It's linear, with a few branching paths here and there, but not nearly enough to break up the monotony, or to make each playthrough feel distinct. After crossing the Road of Sacrifices, where you fight riveting enemies like the Corvians, you get to a swamp called the Crucifixion Woods. Here you have a choice. You can defeat the boss and access the Cathedral of the Deep, a huge, sprawling level where there is very little in terms of interesting or unique content to justify the size, or you can go to another swamp that is even worse than the one before. And that's it, the world design is boring and kills replayability. I guess I don't have a more dramatic way of saying it. I've explained why I'm not a fan of this game. I don't hate it, it's still a quality title that will offer you one good playthrough, but I do think it's poorly designed. For every good thing it does, like satisfying hit detection, cool vistas and some epic and imposing bosses, I guess that's it. It also does many things wrong, to the point where I don't believe the pros outweigh the cons, over multiple playthroughs at least. There was a lot more I wanted to say about this game, but I think the video is long enough already. I'll just end this section by explaining how DS3 was the most popular and successful Souls game, and while that can be attributed in large part to its sleek presentation and cool boss fights, I also think it's partly because of Miyazaki's involvement. If he wasn't present during press release events, and if his name wasn't in the credits, I can safely assume the game's reception would have been worse, at least from the core fans who hold the man with high regard, and were probably disappointed by DS2. Dark Souls 3 is probably a worse sequel than the previous one, despite referencing the first game so much. And I believe it avoided a lot of hatred, specifically because of the choice of imbuing it with so much nostalgia to the beloved DS1. Ultimately, it's a game with a very weak identity and very few good ideas. For all its missteps, DS2 didn't fall in the same traps. But DS3 was extremely successful after all, so it's no surprise that Elden Ring used it so heavily as a foundation.